came back?
I just wanted to see the light in your window again.
She lost her name, her marriage, and her child in a single night, betrayed by the two people she trusted most. Years later, she returns under a new identity, with one goal: make them pay for every lie that destroyed her. Harriet Wynne learned two things on the night her life ended. First, a lie can sound like truth if enough people repeat it. Second, when the person you love most won't meet your eyes, the world can go quiet in a way that feels like drowning. It was raining the way it rains in London when the city has decided to punish everyone equally. Fine needles at first, then a determined soaking sheet that found the gap between collar and skin. Harriet stood outside the glass frontage of Wynne and Harrow solicitors, watching the lights burn white inside as silhouettes moved like fish behind an aquarium wall. She pressed her palm to the glass. Inside, her sister, Charlotte, was laughing. Not the polite laugh Charlotte offered at weddings, or the airy laugh she used to charm a table of strangers. This was the laugh Harriet remembered from childhood, sharp, private, victorious. Charlotte had her head tilted back as if she'd just been told something delightful. Her hair was pinned up in the immaculate twist she wore when she wanted to look serious. She was wearing Harriet's favorite color, navy, because Charlotte had always known how to take the things Harriet loved and wear them as if they belonged to her. The man standing beside Charlotte held a folder in one hand and a pen in the other. He nodded as Charlotte spoke, all efficiency and clipped professional approval. He glanced once, briefly, toward the front door as if he'd heard a sound. Harriet's breath fogged the glass. The folder was labeled with Harriet's name. She pushed the door open. A bell chimed. Warm air struck her face. The smell of paper and coffee and that peculiar cleanliness solicitors' offices have, like money scrubbed to a shine, filled her lungs. Charlotte turned first. Her smile widened a fraction too late, then rearranged itself into something sisterly. "Harry," she said, using the nickname their mother had given Harriet when she was small. "You're drenched. I didn't think you'd come." "I wasn't invited," Harriet replied. The man with the folder, Mr. Harrow, senior partner, the one who'd been mentoring Charlotte, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Wynne, thank you for coming. We'll try to make this as straightforward as possible." Harriet looked past him to the waiting area. Edward sat there, hands clasped, elbows on knees, staring at the floor as though it had offended him. He was wearing his good coat, the charcoal one that made his eyes look paler. His wedding ring was still on. For half a second, Harriet expected him to stand up, to walk to her, to do what he always did when she entered a room, soften. Instead, he stayed seated. Then he raised his head and looked at her. Harriet's stomach folded in on itself. He didn't look at her like a husband. He looked at her like a problem. "Edward," Harriet said, because she didn't know what else to say. "What's going on?" Charlotte took a step closer as if she were about to comfort Harriet, as if this were all a misunderstanding. "Oh, Harry," she murmured, "don't make it harder." Harriet's gaze snapped to her sister. "Harder than what?" Mr. Harrow opened the folder. "Mrs. Wynne, we have reason to believe you've committed fraud, specifically misuse of trust funds and forgery of signatures connected to an account belonging to Mr. Wynne's late father." The words didn't fit into Harriet's head. They fell like foreign coins, heavy and wrong. "I haven't," Harriet said at once. "I don't even have access to—" Charlotte sighed. "Please, we have the documents." Harriet stared at her. "Charlotte, what are you doing?" Charlotte's mouth tightened, barely, but Harriet saw it. "I'm doing what's necessary." Harriet looked to Edward. Tell them it's not true." Edward swallowed. He stood slowly, as though gravity had increased around him. He took 2 steps toward her, then stopped. His eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. There was something bruised in his expression that made Harriet's chest ache. "We went through everything," Edward said quietly. "The signatures, the transfers, your emails." Harriet's heart stuttered. "My emails?" Charlotte glanced at Mr. Harrow with practiced innocence. "We have access to the correspondence. It's all very clear." Harriet's mind ran furiously, searching for a place to put the panic. "Edward, I swear to you, I didn't do this. Somebody—" "Enough," Charlotte cut in, voice brittle as ice. "You always do this. You always twist everything so you're the victim." Harriet blinked. "What?" Charlotte's eyes glittered. "You've had everything handed to you. Mum's sympathy, Dad's attention, Edward's devotion." Her smile was thin. "And you thought you could steal his inheritance too?" Harriet's mouth opened. She couldn't find the words because she couldn't understand what she was hearing. Edward spoke again, softer. "Harry, if you just admit it, maybe we can keep it out of court." Harriet stared at him as if he were a stranger. "You believe her?" Edward flinched. "I've seen it." "You've seen paperwork," Harriet snapped, voice rising. "Paper can be forged. Accounts can be manipulated. Why would I do that?" Edward's face tightened. "Because you've been different. For months. Secretive. And when I asked you—" "I was planning your birthday," Harriet blurted, because that was true. She'd been saving money, hiding receipts. She'd been working extra shifts at the gallery, trying to surprise him. "I was trying to do something nice for you. That's what I was hiding." Charlotte's expression didn't change, but her eyes flicked just once toward Mr. Harrow, an almost imperceptible signal. Mr. Harrow slid a document out of the folder and held it up. Harriet's stomach dropped. The signature at the bottom looked like hers. The loops and slants, the confident flourish at the end. Her hand shook as she reached for it. "It's not mine," Harriet whispered. "It is," Edward said, and the certainty in his voice broke something in her. Harriet turned the page, hands trembling. There were more documents, transfers, amounts that made her dizzy. Dates, her name, her signature. Then she saw something else, a printed email chain stamped with dates and times. Harriet's email address at the top, a message supposedly sent to a private account. "I'll move it in pieces. He won't notice." She felt cold from the inside out. "This isn't me," she said again desperately. "Edward, listen to me. I didn't—" Edward's jaw clenched. "Why can't you just tell the truth for once?" Harriet stared at him. "For once?" Charlotte's hand found Edward's arm. It was gentle, proprietary, intimate. She leaned in, speaking softly enough that Harriet only caught fragments. "We've done all we can. You deserve better. You have to protect your son." "Their son." Harriet's breath caught. "Where is Oliver?" she demanded, turning toward Edward. "Where's my baby?" Edward's eyes flicked away. He didn't answer. Harriet's throat tightened. "Edward, where is he?" Charlotte stepped between them, smiling sadly, like a saint in stained glass. "Oliver's safe." Harriet lunged forward, but Mr. Harrow moved, blocking her with his body. "Mrs. Wynne, please don't touch me," Harriet hissed. Charlotte's voice remained calm. "You're not in a position to make demands. The police have been notified. There will be proceedings." Harriet's vision narrowed. "You called the police?" Edward's silence was answer enough. Harriet's knees weakened. She gripped the edge of the reception desk to stay upright. The room tilted. Charlotte's eyes were bright. "It didn't have to be like this, Harry, but you always think you can do whatever you want." Harriet stared at her sister, seeing suddenly a lifetime of small cruelties. The way Charlotte had borrowed Harriet's clothes and forgotten to return them. The way she'd smiled when Harriet was praised, then made a cutting comment later. The way she'd flirted with Edward at family dinners under the excuse of humor. Harriet looked back at Edward, searching for anything familiar. "Please," she said, voice cracking. "You know me." Edward's face hardened. "I thought I did." The bell above the door chimed again, harsh and cheerful in the tense air. Two uniformed officers entered. Harriet's mind screamed, "No!" Her body didn't move. "Harriet Wynne?" one officer asked. Harriet didn't answer. She couldn't. The room had filled with cotton. Sound came from far away. "Mrs. Wynne," the officer said more firmly, "you need to come with us." Harriet finally found her voice, but it came out as a ragged whisper. "Oliver." Edward's mouth tightened. Then he spoke, eyes on the floor. "He'll be with Charlotte for a while." For a while. Harriet's knees nearly buckled. She couldn't breathe. "You can't." Charlotte's expression softened in a way that made Harriet want to scream. "It's for the best." Harriet turned her head as the officers took her arms, not roughly but firmly, and guided her toward the door. Rainwater dripped from her hair onto the polished floor. The bell chimed again as the door opened. She looked back one last time. Charlotte stood close to Edward, her hand still on his arm. Edward stared past Harriet as if she were already gone. Harriet felt something inside her, something warm, something hopeful, snap cleanly in half. Outside, the rain swallowed her whole. Prison doesn't feel like the films. It doesn't feel like a dramatic descent into darkness where you learn hard lessons and emerge sharper. It feels like fluorescent light that makes everyone look ill. It feels like doors that lock with a final, indifferent sound. It feels like time, thick and slow, pressing against your skin until you can't remember what it felt like to be free. Harriet spent the first week convinced it would be corrected. Someone would realize the mistake. Edward would come, face full of regret, Oliver in his arms, and say, "I'm sorry, I was wrong." No one came. Her solicitor, a tired woman with kind eyes, brought photocopies of the evidence. Harriet's signature, Harriet's email account, Harriet's phone records. "Could someone have accessed your devices?" the solicitor asked. Harriet thought of Charlotte's hands, elegant and clever, of Charlotte's knowledge of passwords, of Charlotte's smiling insistence. "Let me help you organize your finances. You're so bad with admin, Harry." "Yes," Harriet whispered. The solicitor nodded grimly. "We can argue that, but you need proof." Proof? How do you prove the shape of betrayal? Charlotte visited once. She arrived in a tailored coat and a cream scarf, holding herself like a woman doing charity work. Her face was pale, her expression carefully sorrowful. To anyone watching, she looked like a sister trying to mend a tragedy. Harriet sat on the other side of the table, hands trembling with rage. Charlotte's eyes flicked over Harriet's prison uniform. "Oh, Harry," she said softly, "I'm so sorry it came to this." Harriet leaned forward. "Where is my son?" Charlotte sighed. "Safe, loved, he's settled. He's mine." Charlotte's smile was small. "He needs stability. He needs his mother." Harriet's voice shook. "What did you do, Charlotte?" Charlotte's gaze sharpened. The sorrow slipped for a second, revealing something colder underneath. "Don't be melodramatic." "You forged my signature." Charlotte shrugged delicately. "You always were careless with your passwords." Harriet felt her heart slam against her ribs. "You admitted it," Charlotte laughed quietly. "To you? Harry, please, who would believe you?" Harriet's hands curled into fists. "Edward will. He has to. He knows you." Charlotte's smile widened. "Does he?" Harriet's throat tightened. Charlotte leaned forward. "Edward was so tired, Harry. So tired of your moods, your little disappearances, your selfishness. He needed someone who understood him." Harriet's nails bit into her palms. "You slept with him." Charlotte's expression didn't change. "I comforted him. There's a difference." Harriet's vision blurred with fury. "You stole my life," Charlotte's eyes gleamed. I saved Oliver from chaos. Chaos you created, Charlotte's voice hardened. You never deserved what you had. Harriet stared at her sister and realized with sick clarity that Charlotte wasn't doing this because she'd snapped. She wasn't doing it in a moment of madness. Charlotte had wanted Harriet's life for years, and now she had it. Charlotte rose, smoothing her coat. I won't stay long. Visits are unpleasant. Harriet surged to her feet as well, driven by something primal. Tell me where he is. Tell me. Charlotte's face softened again into that saintly mask. Let go, Harry. It's over. It's not over, Harriet whispered. Charlotte tilted her head. What was that? Harriet met her gaze, every muscle trembling. You think you've won? Charlotte smiled pityingly. I have. Harriet's voice dropped lower, steadier. I will get out, and when I do, I will take everything back. Charlotte's eyes flickered just once. Surprise, perhaps, or the first hint of caution. Then she laughed. Oh, Harry, you always did love a fantasy. She turned and walked away. Harriet watched her go, her breath ragged. When the door shut behind Charlotte, Harriet sat back down slowly. Her hands were shaking. Her heart felt hollow. But beneath the hollow, something else stirred. Something hard, something sharp. If Charlotte thought Harriet would disappear quietly, she'd misunderstood the kind of woman she'd destroyed. Harriet pressed her fists to her mouth and breathed until the trembling stopped. She made herself a promise in the stale prison air. I'm coming. Time passed in fragments, the scrape of chairs in the dining hall, the echo of footsteps, the smell of boiled vegetables, the constant hum of other people's despair. Harriet learned to keep her head down. She learned which officers were bored and which were cruel. She learned how to make herself small when she needed to, and how to look unbreakable when she didn't. She also learned patience. Her solicitor managed to get her sentence reduced on appeal. Procedural errors, insufficient verification, the suggestion of manipulation. Harriet clung to those words like a lifeline. On the day she was released, the air outside tasted strange, too open, too alive. She stood on the pavement with a cardboard box of belongings and nowhere to go. Her old phone was gone. Her accounts were frozen. Her flat sold. Charlotte had been efficient. Harriet's mother didn't answer her calls. Edward didn't answer at all. Harriet took the train out of London because London was full of ghosts. She went north to a small coastal town where the wind smelled of salt and the sea hammered the shore like a heartbeat. There, under a name that wasn't hers, she found a room above a bakery and paid cash. At night, she sat on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking of Oliver's face, the soft curve of his cheeks, the way his fingers curled around hers, the small sound he made when he slept. Her chest ached so badly she thought she might split open. She couldn't go to the authorities. Charlotte had money, influence, and a file full of proof that Harriet was unstable and criminal. She needed something else. Harriet needed leverage, so she began to build herself into someone Charlotte wouldn't recognize. She dyed her hair a darker shade, cut it to her jaw. She learned to paint her face differently, sharper brows, deeper lipstick, a look that suggested confidence rather than kindness. She bought new clothes from charity shops and altered them herself until they fit, like intention. She found work in a pub, then as a receptionist at a small estate agency. She smiled at strangers until her cheeks ached. She learned their names, their habits, their secrets. People talked easily to a woman who listened, and all the while she watched. She followed Charlotte's life from a distance, through social media photos, through whispered gossip, through newspaper mentions. Charlotte had married Edward within a year of Harriet's imprisonment. The wedding pictures showed Charlotte in lace, Edward in a dark suit, Oliver, a little taller now, holding a ring cushion like a small page boy. Harriet stared at those pictures until she thought she might be sick. Charlotte had taken Oliver, and Edward had let her. Harriet didn't cry anymore. Crying had become useless. Tears were water, and Harriet had already drowned. Instead, she planned. She found out where they lived, an elegant house in Richmond with a neat garden and tall windows. She learned Edward's routines, leaving at 7:30, returning around 6. Gym on Wednesdays, dinner out twice a month. She learned Charlotte's patterns, charity committees, lunches, Pilates, shopping trips. She learned, too, that things weren't perfect. Edward's firm had been struggling. There were rumors of a partner dispute. Charlotte had been seen arguing with him in public once, her smile tight, his face furious. Harriet's mouth curved when she heard that. Cracks. Cracks meant opportunity. One night, with the wind howling outside her rented room, Harriet sat at the small desk and wrote a new name at the top of a clean page. Amelia Hart. It looked like someone else's life. She practiced the signature until it felt natural, until her hand no longer hesitated. Then she began to create Amelia. A backstory, a history, a trail of small truths woven into a larger lie. Amelia had lived abroad. Amelia had worked in art consultancy. Amelia had money. Enough to be interesting, not enough to be suspicious. Amelia was charming, polished, and just a little dangerous. Harriet looked in the mirror and said the name aloud. Amelia. The woman staring back didn't look like the frightened wife who'd been dragged out of a solicitor's office in the rain. Her eyes were darker now, not in color, but in expression. Harriet smiled, slow and precise. I'm coming, she told the mirror. The first time Harriet saw Edward again, it was from across a gallery. It was a private viewing, quiet, expensive, filled with people who spoke in murmurs as if sound itself was a transaction. Harriet had arranged the invitation through a chain of contacts, presenting herself as Amelia Hart, consultant, potential investor. Edward stood near a large, abstract painting, a glass of white wine in hand. He looked older. His shoulders were tenser, his hair slightly grayer at the temples. He still had the same hands, capable, elegant, hands that had once cupped Harriet's face with tenderness. Harriet's stomach tightened. For a moment, her anger wavered beneath something else, grief, longing, the memory of being loved. Then she remembered Oliver in a ring-bearer suit. She remembered Edward's voice. Why can't you just tell the truth for once? The longing curdled back into purpose. Harriet, Amelia, walked toward him. She wore a black dress with a high neckline and a slit that revealed just enough leg to imply confidence. Her lipstick was a deep berry. Her hair, cut blunt, framed her face like a statement. Edward turned slightly as if sensing her approach. Their eyes met. Harriet felt the moment land between them like a stone. Edward's gaze flicked over her, assessing. He didn't recognize her. Not yet. He saw only a woman. Beautiful work, Harriet said, voice smooth. Edward blinked, then smiled politely. It is, though I'm not sure I understand it. That's usually the point, Harriet replied with a small smile. Art doesn't ask to be understood. It asks to be felt. Edward's smile warmed. You sound like someone who knows what she's talking about. Harriet extended her hand. Amelia Hart. Edward took her hand. His grip was familiar, firm, warm, and Harriet had to steady her breathing. Edward Wynne, he said. Harriet held his gaze. I know. Something shifted in his expression. Have we met? Harriet let her smile linger. Not properly. Edward's brow furrowed, then smoothed. He dismissed the thought, as people do when they can't place a face. Are you thinking of investing? Possibly, Harriet said. I'm considering a series of acquisitions for a private collection. Edward's interest sharpened. Then you should speak to the curator. He'll adore you. I might, Harriet said, but you seem more interesting than the curator. Edward laughed softly, surprised. That's unlikely. Harriet took a sip of champagne, eyes never leaving his. Is it? Edward's gaze lingered on her mouth for half a second too long. Harriet felt a bitter satisfaction unfurl in her chest. Good. Let him want. Let him feel. They spoke for 15 minutes. About art, travel, business. Harriet kept her tone light, teasing, just intimate enough to pull him in. Edward relaxed, shoulders loosening, laughter appearing more easily than Harriet remembered from the last months of their marriage. He was lonely. Loneliness makes people reckless. When Edward's phone buzzed, he glanced down and his expression tightened. Trouble? Harriet asked. Edward forced a smile. Just life. Harriet tilted her head. Life with your wife? Edward's eyes widened slightly. You know I'm married? Harriet's smile remained calm. Your ring. And you have the look of a man who sleeps beside someone but still feels alone. Edward stared at her, startled into honesty. Are you always this direct? He asked. Only when it matters, Harriet said. Edward swallowed. You're dangerous? Harriet offered. He gave a half smile. Perhaps. Harriet leaned closer, lowering her voice. Then perhaps you should stay away from me. Edward didn't move back. His gaze held hers, caught. I should, he agreed, but his voice lacked conviction. Harriet straightened, letting the moment hang. Enjoy the rest of the viewing, Edward. She turned to walk away, leaving him with her scent, her presence, the echo of a promise. She didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes on her like heat. Edward found her again a week later. Harriet had anticipated that. She'd left just enough information with the curator, a business card, a number, not too eager, not too distant. When her phone rang, she was sitting in a cafe overlooking the Thames, rain streaking the windows. Amelia? Edward's voice was uncertain. Yes, Harriet replied, warm. Edward, hello. A pause. I wasn't sure you'd answer. I always answer, Harriet said softly, when I'm curious. Edward exhaled, like a man stepping closer to an edge. I've been thinking about what you said. I say a lot of things, Harriet teased, about being alone. His voice dropped. It's complicated. Harriet looked out at the river, letting the silence stretch, making him feel it. Complicated is rarely happy. Edward gave a humorless laugh. No. Harriet's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. What do you want, Edward? Another pause, then honest and bare. To feel like myself again. Harriet's chest tightened. She remembered the Edward who danced with her in the kitchen, who carried Oliver on his shoulders, who kissed Harriet's knuckles absent-mindedly when he thought she wasn't watching, and she remembered the Edward who let her be taken. Harriet's voice remained gentle. Then meet me. They met in places that felt like secrets, quiet wine bars, bookshops, a park bench under bare trees. Harriet listened, asked questions, smiled at the right moments. Edward talked more than he probably had in years, about stress, about expectations, about Charlotte's relentless perfection. She's always watching, Edward admitted one night, rubbing a hand over his face. Everything has to look right. The house, the family, Oliver's school, even the way I speak at dinner. Harriet's pulse hammered. And does it feel right? Edward's laugh was bitter. No, it feels like living in a picture frame. Harriet leaned forward, eyes soft. Then step out of it. Edward looked at her, raw desire and exhaustion tangled together. I can't. You can, Harriet murmured. You're just afraid of what happens next. Edward's gaze dropped to her lips again. Harriet let him want her. She let it build like pressure. She didn't touch him. Not yet. Because seduction isn't just bodies. It's anticipation. It's letting someone believe they're choosing, when really you've placed every stone in their path. Edward's messages became frequent, then daily, then nightly, when the house was quiet and Charlotte was asleep beside him. Harriet watched the phone screen glow in the dark and felt two emotions wrestle inside her, triumph and a grief so deep it felt ancient. He was coming back to her, but not as Harriet, as Amelia, as the woman she'd become out of ashes. One night Edward called her, voice low, strained. Charlotte knows something's off. Harriet's heart steadied. Does she? She asked me where I'd been. She checked my jacket pockets. He swallowed. She looked through my phone. Harriet's lips curved slightly. And? I deleted everything, Edward said, breath ragged. But she's suspicious. She said I've been distant. Harriet's voice was silk. Have you? Edward laughed softly, miserable. Yes. Good, Harriet said. Edward went quiet. What? Harriet let a beat pass. Distant from her, closer to yourself. Edward's breathing changed. Amelia, what are we doing? Harriet closed her eyes, remembering Charlotte's laugh behind the glass. We're doing what you've been too afraid to do, she said. We're telling the truth with actions. Edward whispered, I want to see you. Then come, Harriet replied. He did. Harriet booked a room in a small hotel near Kensington, tasteful and discreet. She arrived first, standing by the window and watching the city lights blur in the damp night. When Edward knocked, her entire body tensed, not with fear, but with the force of memory. She opened the door. Edward stood there, coat damp, hair slightly mussed by wind. His eyes looked fever-bright. For a moment they just stared. Then Edward stepped inside, shutting the door behind him as if sealing away his life. I shouldn't be here, he whispered. Harriet tilted her head. Then leave. Edward didn't move. Harriet walked closer, slow. Edward. His gaze dropped to her mouth. His hands flexed, uncertain. Harriet reached up and touched his cheek, lightly with the gentleness of a ghost. Edward exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for years. His hand came up, covering hers, pressing her palm to his skin. You feel, he murmured. Real. Harriet swallowed the sudden sting behind her eyes. I am. Edward leaned forward, stopping just short of her lips. Tell me to stop. Harriet's smile was faint. I won't. Edward kissed her. It was hungry, desperate, full of everything he'd denied himself. Harriet kissed him back with practiced heat, letting desire and vengeance braid together until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Edward's hands slid to her waist, gripping. God, he whispered against her mouth, I've missed. He stopped, startled by his own words. Harriet pulled back slightly, eyes searching his. Missed what? Edward's throat worked. This. Feeling. Harriet traced her fingertip down his jaw. Then take it. They moved to the bed like people falling. Later, in the quiet after, Edward lay beside her, chest rising and falling, staring at the ceiling. Harriet watched him, heart pounding. This was the moment she knew. When the story could change, when she could reveal herself, rip off the mask, watch him crumble. But she wasn't done. Not yet. Because the true punishment wasn't just pain. It was understanding. It was letting Edward feel what he'd thrown away, then showing him the cost. Edward turned his head to her. Amelia, I don't know what happens now. Harriet smiled, soft and deadly. Now? She whispered. Now you start telling yourself the truth. Edward swallowed. And what's the truth? Harriet's gaze held his. Her voice was quiet. That you're capable of betraying the woman who trusted you. Edward flinched. That's not. It is, Harriet murmured. But don't worry. People do terrible things when they're weak. The important part is what you do next. Edward stared at her, shaken. Harriet reached out, smoothing his hair back like she used to, like a wife. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. Harriet's chest tightened, and for a second she almost hated herself. Then she remembered Charlotte's voice. "Who would believe you?" Harriet's hand stilled. She knew exactly what she would do next. Charlotte's downfall began with a whisper, not an accusation. Those were too obvious, too easy to dismiss. A whisper placed carefully among her friends, a suggestion, a question. Harriet attended a charity luncheon Charlotte helped organize, wearing pearls and a smile. She arrived as Amelia Hart, introduced through a chain of acquaintances. Charlotte was too busy performing benevolence to question it. When Charlotte finally turned and saw Harriet, Amelia, standing near the champagne, Charlotte's smile faltered for half a heartbeat. Harriet raised her glass in greeting, serene. Charlotte approached, eyes narrowing. "Amelia Hart, is it?" "Yes," Harriet replied warmly. "And you are Charlotte Wynne. I've heard so much." Charlotte's smile returned, but it was tight. "All good things, I hope." "Of course," Harriet said. "Your work is admired. Such devotion to family, too." Charlotte's eyes flashed. "Family is everything." Harriet tilted her head. "It must be, especially when you've had to protect it from unpleasantness." Charlotte went still. Harriet leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough to feel intimate. "It's strange," she murmured, "how easily a person can be erased." Charlotte's gaze sharpened, like a knife sliding free. Harriet smiled politely and stepped away before Charlotte could speak. Across the room, Harriet watched Charlotte's fingers tighten around her glass. Charlotte's composure held, but her eyes darted, hunting. Good. Let her feel watched. That night, Edward came to Harriet again, restless, guilty, craving. Harriet let him, because every time he crossed that line, the ground under Charlotte's perfect life cracked further. Then Harriet began to collect proof. Edward had access. Emails, accounts, legal documents. He didn't know he was handing Harriet the tools to dismantle the lie that had imprisoned her, but he was. In his guilt, he became generous. "I want to make things right," he whispered once, sitting on Harriet's bed with his face in his hands. "I don't know how," Harriet stroked his hair. "Start by being honest," she murmured, and so Edward began to talk about the past. About the way Charlotte had helped him gather evidence, about how quickly the paperwork had appeared, about how Harriet's email account had been oddly easy to access once Charlotte offered to handle things. Harriet recorded it all, not with obvious devices, nothing that would make Edward suspicious. She used a small recorder disguised as a lipstick tube. She stored copies in places Charlotte would never find. One rainy afternoon, Harriet sat alone and listened to Edward's voice confess, haltingly, how he'd doubted Harriet, how he'd let the process move forward because it was easier than questioning Charlotte. Harriet's hands shook as she turned the recorder off. She wasn't just collecting proof. She was collecting the sound of Edward's betrayal. When she finally confronted Charlotte, she wanted Charlotte to understand exactly what had been done. And she wanted Edward to hear it too. It happened on a Sunday. Harriet knew Charlotte's habits: brunch at home, then a walk in the park with Oliver, then quiet time while Edward caught up on emails. A perfect little tableau. Harriet sent Edward a message. "Meet me. 1 hour, same place." He arrived, anxious, eyes searching her face. "What is it?" Harriet's expression was calm. "I want you to come with me." "Where?" "You'll see." Edward hesitated. "Amelia," Harriet stepped closer, voice soft. "Do you trust me?" Edward swallowed, then nodded. Harriet led him to Richmond, to the street where the house stood, Charlotte's house, Harriet's stolen home. Edward's steps slowed as recognition hit. "What are you doing?" he whispered. Harriet looked at him, eyes steady. Taking back what's mine. Edward's face drained of color. What? Harriet reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. Inside is a key, she said. Your spare. The one you keep in your car. The one Charlotte doesn't know about. Edward stared. How did you? Harriet smiled faintly. You told me where it was. You tell me a lot when you're desperate. Edward's breathing turned shallow. Amelia, who are you? Harriet didn't answer. She walked up the path and unlocked the front door. The house smelled exactly the way Harriet remembered. Polish, lavender, money. Edward stepped in behind her like a man entering a dream. From the living room came Charlotte's voice, bright and cheerful. Edward, is that you? Then Oliver's laughter, high and sweet, followed by the thump of small feet. Harriet's heart cracked open. Oliver appeared in the doorway, hair falling into his eyes, cheeks flushed. He froze when he saw Harriet, Amelia, standing there, his brow furrowed. Daddy? Edward looked at Oliver, guilt washing over his face. Charlotte appeared behind Oliver, still smiling, until she saw Harriet. The smile died. For a second, Charlotte simply stared, as if her mind refused to accept what her eyes were telling her. Then her face sharpened. You, she hissed. Harriet took a slow breath and let the mask fall. Not all at once, just enough. The angle of her smile, the coldness in her eyes, the stillness. Charlotte's lips parted. Harriet, Edward's head snapped toward her. Harriet? His voice was a rasp. No. Harriet looked at him. Hello, Edward. Edward staggered back as if struck. His mouth opened, closed. Amelia, you. I'm Harriet, she said calmly. Oliver looked between them, confused. Mummy? Harriet's chest clenched so hard she thought she might collapse. She dropped to her knees, opening her arms. Yes, sweetheart, she whispered. It's me. I'm here. Oliver hesitated only a second before running into her arms. Harriet wrapped him tight, burying her face in his hair, breathing him in like oxygen. Charlotte's voice cut through the moment like a blade. Get away from him. Harriet lifted her head slowly, eyes meeting Charlotte's. No. Charlotte stepped forward, trembling with rage. You shouldn't be here. You're a criminal. Harriet stood, keeping Oliver close. Am I? Edward's voice was broken. Harry, why didn't you tell me? Harriet looked at him, expression unreadable. Would you have believed me? Edward flinched. Charlotte's eyes darted, calculating. Edward, call the police. Harriet's smile was sharp. Go on, Charlotte. Call them. Charlotte's hand moved toward her phone. Harriet lifted the lipstick-shaped recorder from her bag and placed it on the hall table with deliberate care. Charlotte's gaze snagged on it. What is that? Harriet pressed play. Edward's voice filled the hallway, tinny but clear. Charlotte offered to handle my emails, said she could access Harriet's account. She showed me the messages. Edward went pale. Oh, God, Charlotte's face twisted. Turn that off. Harriet didn't. Edward's voice continued, layered with regret. I didn't check properly. I wanted it to be over. I let it happen. Oliver clung to Harriet, eyes wide. Charlotte lunged for the recorder, but Harriet caught her wrist with iron strength. Don't, Harriet said softly. Charlotte's eyes burned. You ruined everything. Harriet leaned closer, voice low enough that only Charlotte could hear. You ruined me. Charlotte's breath came fast. You think this proves anything? It's just his guilt talking. People will still believe the documents. Harriet's smile widened. That's why this isn't all I have. She pulled out a file, copies of access logs, email forwarding rules, small technical details she'd painstakingly gathered through contacts and favors. Not perfect, but enough to raise questions, enough to reopen what had been closed. Charlotte stared at it, fear finally creeping in. How? Harriet's eyes glittered. You taught me how easily a person can be erased. I learned. Edward's voice cracked. Charlotte, did you do it? Charlotte lifted her chin, defiant. I did what I had to. Edward stared as if he'd never seen her before. You destroyed Harriet. Charlotte's gaze flicked to Harriet with pure hatred. She was in the way. Oliver whimpered, pressing closer to Harriet. Harriet stroked his hair, then looked at Edward. Her voice was steady. You let her. Edward's face collapsed. I'm sorry. Harriet nodded once, as if accepting the word without forgiving it. Sorry doesn't return years. Edward swallowed, tears in his eyes. Tell me what to do. Harriet's gaze turned back to Charlotte. First, she said, you tell the truth. Charlotte laughed, shrill. Never. Harriet smiled, calm as the sea before a storm. Then I will. Charlotte's breath hitched. You can't take him. Harriet looked down at Oliver. He stared up at her with wet eyes, fingers gripping her sleeve. Harriet's voice softened. I'm not taking him like property. I'm bringing him home. Edward's shoulders sagged. Harry, please. Harriet met his gaze. You'll testify, she said. You'll tell them what happened. You'll admit you were complicit. If you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows you slept with Amelia Hart while married to Charlotte. Edward closed his eyes, shame flooding his face. I will, he whispered. I will. Charlotte's face turned white. Edward. Edward looked at Charlotte with something like disgust. No. Charlotte's mouth opened, then shut, her perfect control cracking. Harriet watched her sister's composure crumble and felt no joy, only a cold, clean certainty. This was justice, not the gentle kind, the kind that leaves scars. Harriet knelt again, lifting Oliver into her arms. He wrapped his arms around her neck, trembling. Harriet turned toward the door. Charlotte's voice followed, hoarse. You think you've won? Harriet paused, looking back over her shoulder. No, she said quietly. I think you've finally lost Toggle. And then Harriet stepped out into the rain with her son in her arms, the sound of Charlotte's rage trapped behind the closed door, like thunder behind glass. Outside, the sky was still gray, the city still wet and cold, but Harriet breathed in anyway, because for the first time in years the air didn't taste like drowning. It tasted like beginning.